My name's Jimmy Kyle. I'm from Chasing Ghosts. Chasing Ghosts, a Naarm-based band, and I'm in Lutruwita in Tasmania, Launceston. But the majority of the band's in Naarm and been there in Melbourne for a long time. And our new single is a single called Amnesia Everybody, and it's about colonial cop killers and the massacres in Australia, led by police officers, and the collective amnesia the country has around what's happened here.
Beautiful, mate. Thanks for joining us today, Jimmy.
No worries.
You mentioned that Chasing Ghosts recently released your new single, Amnesia Everybody, not long ago, actually. So, how's the early response been to it?
Yeah, great. I think it's overwhelmingly really, really, really good. I think it's just like reinvigorated the fan base after a couple of years since our previous release, which was Homelands, which did really well, and um, this one's taken a little bit longer, just between moving between record labels, and sometimes that can take a little bit longer than we'd like, and yeah, so it's been we've been waiting for about 12 months to have released this stuff, which has given us an opportunity to write for a future record in the interim, but it's really, really relieving and satisfying to be able to share this with people now.
Yeah. Now, we'll get into the song itself in a bit more greater detail soon, mate. But first, tell us about the song musically and what you were going for with it.
Um, I think musically it was it has like a little bit of this midnight oil that's kind of like in my DNA from being a kid listening to Midnight Oil records. And there's just a little bit of that Hearst style drumming. Like it's sort of really driven by the drums, and it's a lot more high energy, probably from previous Chasing Ghost records, and it's a lot more polished than previous Chasing Ghost records. So between the earlier material and the later material, one of the places I felt we could evolve was in bringing a really polished sound to the music, and that's not something we'd done traditionally. I'd always been um, someone who's interested in like recording to tape, using reel to reel and half-inch tape, and um, I didn't use things like beat detectors or auto tune, or I didn't really go into Pro Tools if I could avoid it. And as the records have evolved, I've sort of expanded my ideas around that, and left some of that traditionalist, stubborn kind of archaic ways in the past, and have seen the light and have joined the contemporary new world producers in all the luxuries that exist now when recording music. So that's probably one of the big changes. It's big and shiny, and that's been really good for us. It's been something that's we've sort of moved out of that lo-fi kind of Poison City Records sounding punk rock bands into something that's a little bit more luscious. It's a little less intimate, but it's definitely big, shiny, and powerful.
Yeah, very good. Now, as you say, the song itself lyrically, it deals with a very important issue, mate, or important issues. So, tell us a bit more about that.
Well, probably if you're like most Australians, there's probably a pretty big blind spot around race relationships, and a lot of that comes from, and in particular with First Nations people, not necessarily with others, but with Aboriginal folks, and a lot of that probably has to do with that in our history that we taught at school. Most people that I would speak to have raised that there's a big gap in their education around what's actually occurred in the country, and that people have some broad understanding, but in reality, the period of time before the mining boom, the gold rush, and uh, sort of back from the First Fleet, there's 70 years in our curriculum we just don't talk about. And in that 70 years, the East Coast and the West Coast were in endless skirmishes, battles, wars, confrontations with First Nations peoples. And a lot of those people that led those battles, that led from an English perspective, many of the people that have schools, universities, cities, towns named after them, and many of them were open massacres on what you might say as civilians. And I guess there's this gap in the Australian psyche that one, that Aboriginal people, we did defend our nations with warriors that led resistances like Yagan and Jundamara on the west coast, and on in Tassie it was people like Truganini and Malboina and Tunaminawait, and in Queensland it was people like Billy Barlow and Dundalli, and in places like New South Wales, it was Pumulway and Windarine and Garibaldi, and lots of resistance fighters all around the country fought and led their nations to fight back against British colonialism. And I think the what people probably aren't cognizant of is that massacres that did kill women and children, that we often have idolized these people and sanitized um, their crimes and sanitized their history and whitewashed it to make them out to be honorable people, when in reality, they were murderers, and they were murderers of children and innocent civilians that were defending their homelands. So, a really good example of that might be Governor James Sterling High School. Governor James Sterling led the Pinjarra massacre on the Bindjarab Noongar people in Boorloo or Perth. And, I wouldn't think it's appropriate to name a high school Martin Bryant High School. And he led a massacre in this country. And everyone was, has to remember how massacres like that, or the Christchurch Killer massacre in New Zealand, how they profoundly affected our nations. And that's no different. That's really no different, except for we don't sanitize Martin Bryant, um, and what he did. We hold him accountable and we put him in a prison cell for it. That's like one small example. There's quite a lot of others that I could illustrate for you. We've named our cities after slavers, like Robert Towns, the slaver that Townsville is named after. Benjamin Boyd, the largest slaver in Australia, that Boyd Town is named after. Um, Mackay is named after John Mackay, another slaver. And between the three of them, they enslaved 65,500 people in a period of time when there would have been lucky to be 100,000 non-Indigenous people in the country. The fact that most people don't know that, and that's not on the forefront of people's minds, um, especially when dealing in Indigenous communities and South Sea Islander communities, I think is evident in the poor relationships that we've got today. Um, so songs like this are about bringing it back to people's attention to understand that there, if, there's not a country on the planet that colonization has affected that the people colonized do as well as the colonizer. In every single country that's been colonized, the colonized are the powerful. They hold the reins, they hold the purse strings, they steal the land, they take the resources, they decimate the population. And then if that population over the course of time talks out against these things, they're gaslit as being the problem. And I think most people today could see that that's the reality of Australia, that we're in an occupied country that doesn't have a treaty with its First Nations people. We're the only Commonwealth country on the planet that doesn't have a treaty with First Nations people. And we're also have the worst statistics of every country that has been colonized that doesn't have treaties with First Nations people. So this it creates a culture that one doesn't know the atrocities that have occurred on its soil. It creates a culture where victim blaming Aboriginal people for our own dispossession is common, which would be in any other circumstances probably frowned upon, where it's quite normalised in Australia to victim blame Indigenous people for our own dispossession. Um, and that'd be like trying to, blame, say, Ukraine for Russia invading and saying, oh, well, it's might is right. And I think Australians that think of arguments like might is right or we conquered Indigenous people, um, which I've heard a lot of that sort of narrative, I think they have to remember that if you believe might is right and the CCP one day decides to give Australia a run for its money, they might want to remember that might is not always right. And also is at the time, we have to also understand that how would we expect First Nations people to respond to being occupied? And there's I think we can see how everyone else on the planet who's occupied, like the Palestinian people, for example, um, in the West Bank and in Gaza, it doesn't look like people are very grateful for the situation. It looks like people are very resistant. And so that same sort of ethos for Aboriginal people still exists, that this is Aboriginal land, that many people call it home and they're welcome to call it home. But we have to reckon with our past like mature adults and understand that, only 80 years ago, we still had massacres occurring in the Northern Territory, that 50% of the massacres were led by colonial police officers that killed unsuspecting, innocent people en masse within hundreds and hundreds of people at a time, such as the Coniston Station massacre, which was in 1928, in between World War One and World War Two, and or the Rufus River massacre of 1926 in Western Australia. And I think if you start to timeline these dates, arguments like when are we going to get over it? That'd be like me saying to someone, well, when are you going to get over World War One and World War Two? And telling that to a digger, that'd be highly offensive. It'd be that those conflicts have shaped our nation's identity, but so have these massacres shaped Aboriginal people's identity as well. It's left an indelible impact on us, and the lack of recognition, the lack of responsible, mature dialogue has declined us into silly Facebook comments, Sky News insanity, and Rupert Murdoch brainwashing people. So it's a shame that we don't have a curriculum that can mitigate some of that irrational hyperbole that we hear in the media. And the reality is we don't have a curriculum that teaches it. And so I'm fortunate to be one of the people that do teach this subject as a content expert, as a professional in the field, and it naturally, as an Aboriginal man, it permeates some of my songwriting. And if you're a punk like I am, and I've always proudly been into punk rock and metal and hardcore and those sorts of things, is you have your microphone is your weapon, and you have an obligation um, to speak up and to speak truth to power. And some people get their feathers ruffled by it, but I think it's ironic that the same people who get their feathers ruffled by it probably still sing Rage Against the Machine, Killing in the Name, and don't realize what the lyrics are about. So when you hear, lines like some of those that were enforcers are the same that burn crosses, that is Australia's policing. You'd only have to look at the most recent Northern Territory Police Commissioner that this year resigned after he was pushed out because he apologised to First Nations people for the atrocities that had occurred in only 80 years ago in the Northern Territory, the open poisoning of people, the open shooting of people. 80 years ago, I asked people to think about how old their grandparents are. And imagine, in Australia, we have different lived experiences, and some non-Indigenous people that come to the country have brilliant experiences, and that's terrific. We want more of that. But for many First Nations people, it is in the lived memory of people, it is in the historical memory, it is in the family DNA that we know who the murderers were. We know about people like Frank Hahn, the headhunter of the Gulf and Carpentaria, who, decapitated people and sent their skulls to Europe. We know down here about in Tasmania about people like William Crowther, who dug up Aboriginal people's bodies and cut them up and sent them to Europe, and 3 years later became the premier of the state. We know about the Edward Hentys that led the first massacres in Tasmania and Victoria. And of course, we named a town after him as well. And this goes on and on. These killer cops have streets named after them in Darwin and Alice Springs. They have a plethora of things that try and make them seem like decent people. But the basic tenets we have as adults that we would teach children is not to steal, not to be violent, to use your words to resolve things, but yet we hold these adults up on statues, naming high schools after them, cities after them, that we know exactly what they've done. And that's like a cognitive dissonance when we talk about Australia believing in mateship or the fair go, or that we're a country that believes you should be measured on your merit, not by the color of your skin. And it's not to make people feel guilty. They don't have to feel guilty. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to actually recognize what's occurred in the country and make some mature roads forward.
Very well said, mate. So along those lines, bro, like when you're writing songs like this, like, are you more writing them for yourself to sort of get it off your chest, or are you writing it in the hope and belief that other people might take it on board and understand?
Both, maybe. Both is probably the answer. I find it really hard as a First Nations person to buy into the jingoism of Australia. I find it hard because it's built on a lot of fabrication, and I'd love to participate in some sort of sense of patriotic nationalism of some sort. I'd love to, but I can't. No, I can't as long as if we're not being honest with one another. It's an elephant in the room, and it feels disingenuous. And when I see the response to things as gracious as being welcomed to country, and now we have rednecks driving around with stickers saying, "Don't welcome me to my own country." It's sad. Like 5 years ago, they wouldn't even known what traditional lands they're on, and they don't think, well, we've made Aboriginal people tolerate the national anthem that states that we're young and free when we're the oldest continent, we're the oldest people on the in the world, and we're the most incarcerated black population on the planet, 8 times higher than apartheid in South Africa, in Western Australia, 11 times higher in the Northern Territory. In fact, in the Northern Territory at the moment, every single child in detention is Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, which is bizarre because that would infer that white children never commit crimes, which means that in every other state, somehow where white kids commit crimes, usually 70% of the prison system would be white because of the population, that somehow in the Northern Territory, white kids just don't commit crimes. They just never, ever, 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 ever stuff up. And Aboriginal kids seem to always be the ones. How can we have 100% incarceration of a group of people that make up 30% of the territory population? And the answer to that would be, well, perhaps the same people that were leading massacres and staying in power until 1967, people like Alexander Downer's grandfather who supplied the bullets. And then you wonder how we get these legacy politicians that hold racist beliefs. So perhaps those people have left a culture in the police force where Aboriginal people are over-policed. Non-Indigenous kids are seen as kids. They're not seen as adults. And that in the words of Mandela, that we might understand that wherever there is poverty, we will find crime. That doesn't mean people don't have personal responsibility or accountability, but instead of working with communities as partners, what we see is paternalism. We see treating Aboriginal people like we're children, giving people, telling people based on where they live or on their race whether or not they're allowed to have a drink, which I find weird because here in Tasmania, I can go into any pub and see drunk white fellas all the time. And no one says anything about their whiteness being the issue. I can go to Melbourne and see every pub chock a block full of drunk white fellas. And no one brings up their whiteness as the catalyst for their alcoholism. In fact, if you're white and you drink, you're an Aussie larrikin. You're a champion. You know, we write songs about it, like going on smoko and having beers and all that vibe. And there's nothing wrong with that. But let's be consistent across the board that if we're holding one group to accountability, then perhaps we need to hold everyone to accountability.
Very cool, brother. Now, is Amnesia Everybody a standalone single for you guys, or is it the start of a new cycle?
Start of a new cycle, bruh.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What can you tell us about that? How far advanced is it? What sort of directions are going to take?
More energy, more sing-alongs, more anthems, more attitude,
Ah, cool.
just more, just more. I was trying to think, every record's changed, like Chasing Ghosts started out as like a punk troubadour doing acoustic folk music in the first record, and then we're sort of full records down the track and gone back to many of us played in hardcore bands and punk bands years ago. And it's sort of embodied some of that. It's come back to big energy sort of music and the quiet patch, the quiet ballads have probably dissipated into the past, and there's a resurgence of punk rock again.
What do you put that down to, bro? Like it's a lot of people grow and change over time in music, but the change you've described then from the acoustic sort of stuff to the full on punk stuff coming back, like
It's the
what
opposite.
why is it changed? Like what's happened with you guys to make that change?
Um, I think when I left the hardcore scene, or I thought I left, like 13 years ago, um, it was a real toxic kind of place. It's a lot better now, thank God. It was full of egos and skinny leg jeans. And um, I find it really bizarre that blokes with such skinny jeans would act like they're such tough fellas.
Good point.
And there's a lot of hair straighteners, I remember, and a lot of hairspray and look, it was dope. It was a lot of good stuff too. Like I'm not gonna knock all of it. It was a lot of good stuff, but I left and I didn't like the attitude it had, and I wanted to go and write something humble, something reflective. And I borrowed my dad's guitar. I didn't even have an acoustic guitar. I didn't have a lot of self-confidence in my ability to write songs. And it was like a rebirth. And so I released that and toured it around Australia, Asia, New Zealand, eventually to Europe, and sort of paved a bit of a way forward in that folk punk space. And, there were a couple other people doing similar things at the time, and then by the time I did the second record, I did it with Andrew from Comeback Kid, Andrew Newfield. And it was like, again, it wasn't a hardcore record, even though it was a bunch of hardcore guys. It was a different type of record. It was like a rock and roll record, I guess. And then by the time the third incarnation came around, we'd started to move back towards our punk rock roots. And here we are now. And I just think I needed to express something in a different way at the time, and Chasing Ghosts has, reincarnated itself several times over, and hopefully continues to do that. I grew up on that legacy of bands that didn't release the same album three times in a row. That they challenged themselves to write something broader and bigger, and I don't know if I nail that, but I think it's definitely in my DNA as a songwriter.
Oh. Now, you also set out on tour to promote the single next month, starting in Brisbane on October 10th. Then you hit Sydney and Melbourne over consecutive nights. So, what can people expect from Chasing Ghosts on those shows?
A lot of fun. Um, a lot of I'm going to let the music do the talking. I think, I've done some sort of spoken word acoustic solo shows that have been really fun in the past. This will be time to have a drink, time to bring your mates, time to have a sing along, and bang your head a bit and tap your foot and get rowdy. And we're just really keen to get out and see lots of old friends that are coming out, which is great. Lots of young fans coming out, and people that have been on the journey with us this whole time. So we're just excited to be able to see people and get out there and play music and bring some new tunes to the stage.
Fantastic. And just so someone's watching this and they like the sound of the band and they want to come, they don't know you too well, give us three songs from Chasing Ghosts to listen to so they know what to expect.
All right, well, latest single, Amnesia, everybody, got to jump on that for sure. Busted Lung, which has probably been our most successful single previously, which is a folk punk banger. So I think people might dig that one. And I'm going to go with a track called An Anthem for Bastards, Liars, and Cheats. They might enjoy that one as well. So lots of punk rock, lots of storyteller lyrics, and yeah, lots of attitude. So hopefully everyone comes out and has a ball.
Fantastic, Jimmy. Well, thanks very much for your time, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Amnesia, everybody is out now. The tour is in Brisbane, October 10th, Sydney, October 11th, Melbourne, October 12th. So get along and support the boys.
Thanks, Chris. Cheers.